Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for part 2 of our 3-part webinar series with HabitSafe and myosh. We're thrilled to have you here as we dive deeper into the neuroscience behind human behaviour and safety. My name is Christina, and on behalf of myosh, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Now, if you joined us for part 1, you'll know that we've been exploring why traditional safety strategies have hit a plateau. We've been asking the big question, what are we missing? And today we're going to be getting even closer to that answer. Now, we know that much of what we do is on autopilot. Neuroscience tells us that up to 95% of our actions are driven by the subconscious neural pathways. In this session, we'll unpack the interplay between autopilot and conscious thinking, and most importantly, how we can use these insights to create safer behaviours in the workplace and beyond. Now, guiding us through this discussion is Cristian, who is the founder and director of HabitSafe. With over 20 years of experience and a deep passion for applying neuroscience with behavioural research to safety, Cristian has helped countless individuals and organisations rethink their approach to risk and awareness. Now, before we get started, just a quick note, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the session, and if we don't get to them all today, fear not, we'll have more time in the next session to come to make sure we can continue this conversation with you all. So I'm going to stop yapping on, and with that, let's dive into let's dive in. Well, we won't be diving into Cristian, will we? Cristian, over to you.
Thanks very much, Christina. Look, thanks very much for joining us. I always start my webinars with a warning, and I go, look, I've got a reputation for looking at things differently. I like science, and the reason why I mention that is because I've seen lots of different approaches to safety, and I've always followed where the evidence leads. And in my experience, that's not always where safety goes. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the evidence that led me to some of the conclusions about what the main drivers of human behavior are. So from the first webinar, we identified the problem, which was the safety performance is stagnating. Now, you see the graph there, that's Australia workplace fatalities. So there's been no improvement since 2013 and probably no improvement since 2010 or only marginal. But you can see that the decades before that, we made a considerable amount of improvement. Why? Well, because when we started, there were lots of hazards around and people had this, I guess, sort of habit of not thinking about safety. So the things that we did originally have gotten us so far, but it's kind of difficult to get any further. Now, if you think it's just an Australian problem, well, it's actually pretty much the same graph in the US, in the UK, and I suspect in places like New Zealand and Canada. And that's even though today we do more for safety and we do it better than ever before. So in about 2011, 2012, we asked ourselves a question, and that is, what are we missing that's important? Now, from the first webinar, the 3 main brain myths holding us back, because when we asked that question, what we found is a lot of the answers came around from the discoveries of neuroscience. So the first one is that knowledge is enough to do things safely. Now, we assume that if people know what can hurt them, they will avoid getting hurt. And I wish that was 100% true. Now, knowledge serves those that don't know, but we did a survey recently of about 200 incident investigations with our clients, and what we found was only in less than 2% of those incident investigations did people not know about the hazard or not know about the control that needed to be put in place. Yet, most of the corrective actions for those incident investigations, just about 100% of them, they all had either a training, a retraining, or a refresher aspect to it. Now, the second brain myth is people can consciously control their safety. And we assume that if people can keep safety front of mind, they will avoid getting hurt. I wish that was true, but that's not how the brain actually works. So the conscious mind gets into the game when things are new or different. And he gets out of the game when things are familiar. And most of what we do is familiar. And what the discoveries of neuroscience show, like Christina mentioned, is that 95% of what we do originates in the subconscious. And the third brain myth is that we can't do anything about inattention, because inattention happens in people's heads and there's nothing we can do with what's going on in their head. Now, that's not true. Most inattention is avoidable, but it is not avoidable by working with a conscious mind. We need to start working with the subconscious mind in order to understand what's going on in there better and influence inattention. Now, in safety, the three brain myths have resulted in a reliance on the safety system, especially the paperwork, a focus on conversations about the importance of safety to make it an attitude or a value. The idea here is that, or the assumption here is that if you have safety as an attitude or as a value, you will keep it front of mind. We know from the neuroscience that that's kind of difficult to do. And the last thing is we'll only do things around the worker. Now, I'm not suggesting that we need to stop doing these things, but given the data, the conclusion that I come to is that it can't be all we do. So until 15 years ago, we thought it was all we could do. These days, thanks to the discoveries of neuroscience, we know better. And the interesting thing for me is that most of what we currently do in safety keeps ignoring the discoveries of neuroscience. As Albert Einstein said, that we cannot solve problems with the same thinking we used to create them. And although the things that we're currently doing worked decades back, 30, 40, 50 years ago, we're now sort of we've got a different problem to solve. And I mean, the reason why I love science is because we get to question what we do, and we need to look for evidence that comes from a scientific process. When we gain evidence from a scientific process, we know that we're moving in the right direction. Now, we think our brain works like a scientist. And what I mean by that is that, we look at all the data, we assess it properly, and then we make a logical, rational decision on how things work. Unfortunately, that's not how our brain works. It works much more like a lawyer. So what we do is we decide what feels intuitively right, and that could be because it makes us feel good, or it's what what everybody thinks, or something along those lines. Then what we do is we use our conscious mind to create a story that justifies whatever decision we made or whatever interpretation we gave something. And the third thing is we look at facts. Now, we don't always look at facts, but when we look at facts, we tend to only look at those that validate what we decided in the first place. And this is not just an issue for workers or managers, it's also an issue for people that work in safety too. Now, in safety, we are stuck on the three brain myths because they feel intuitively right. But what feels intuitively right is not what's actually going on inside our heads. To improve performance, what do we need to do? Well, at the moment, it's kind of same old, same old. We keep doing the same things under a different label and expect things to change. Now, for me, that's the definition of insanity. It's like we keep taking the same medicine out of a different bottle and expect it to all of a sudden be miraculously fixed. So from what we've sort of learned about safety, there's not just one thing you need to focus, there's a number of different things. So firstly, we need to improve our ability to influence. So by showing care, building trust, being inclusive, psychological safety, all those kind of things are important to open the lines of communication. But just by doing that doesn't have much of an impact on safety. We've also got to use that open line of communication in order to improve the areas that impact safety. And those are, you can either eliminate hazards, you can put effective controls in place or more effective controls in place, or other words, improve the system, or you can get people to keep safety front of mind, but we know that that's kind of 5% of the problem. So that's what we've done so far. And from the data, what we've concluded is that's not enough. So like I said to you before, soon after 2010, we asked that question, what are we missing that's important? And we looked at discoveries of neuroscience, and what we discovered is that a lot of what happens inside people's heads happens subconsciously. And we need to find a way by which we can help people deal with the subconscious brain modes better. Now, things we do around the worker, those are still valid, but it's not really enough. We need to get into more and deeper into what's going on with the person. So what do? Well, we use the discoveries of neuroscience to prevent incidents, additional benefits that we also get to improve engagement and move safety culture forward. And we do that by teaching people how to detect and be on guard against the causes of avoidable inattention. Because when you start thinking about it, inattention is avoidable, at least most of it is. We also help people build attentive habits so they can prevent incidents. And once you have people with attentive habits, you don't need somebody else around them in order to keep them safe. A good deal of the time, they'll have the skills required in order to keep themselves safe. And the third thing that we do is we work with leaders to ensure long-term sustainability. It's one thing to provide training. It's another thing to provide a system in order for people to have those attentive habits into the long term. In essence, to rewire their brain so that they get to keep those skills. So as Christina mentioned, neuroscience shows, and there's plenty of science on this, that up to 95% of what we do originates in the subconscious. So it originates in a place that we're not aware of, which begs the question, what drives what we do? And when we talk to people and they're considering behaviour, we ask them to keep this kind of imagery in mind. So there we are, sitting on our conscious mind, exercising control. Behind us, there's this huge, powerful subconscious with a series of skills and habits that are informed by the outcomes of our previous experience. Now, either of these two can influence behaviour. It's just the subconscious is much more powerful. So it tends to do it more often. Now, the issue is that we're only aware of that one, so we think that is all there is. But from neuroscience, what we're learning is that behaviour is mostly a back of mind function, even though it feels like a front of mind function. And I'll talk about why that is in a little while. So let me give you an example. If I said to you, when you get in your car, what do you do first? Do you turn it on or do you put your seatbelt on? What about when you got dressed this morning? Did you put your sock on your left foot first or your right foot first? Do you shower, then brush your teeth, or do you brush your teeth and then shower? Well, some people, maybe they do both at the same time. Know or don't know doesn't really matter. What matters is to recognize that you do the same thing every day without a lot of conscious thought because you've done it plenty of times before. Now, that's what makes it subconscious, under the surface. You're aware of what you're doing, but you're not making active conscious decisions at every step of the way. Because if you did, then you'd need a nap by the time you got to work. And what neuroscientists are trying to tell us is that repetition enables people to do many things without a lot of conscious thought. Now, when we show this as part of our training, from time to time, there's somebody that says something along the lines of, well, sort of putting my socks on is not particularly dangerous. That's why I allow myself to do it in autopilot. And our response is this. All right, well, let's look at the most dangerous thing you're going to do today, the drive home. Have you ever driven home and can't remember much? And I'm not talking when you were off your face either. So it's talking about sobering, when people are sober. Do you know why that happens? Well, the reason why that happens is because most of the driving that we do in autopilot. And when we are in autopilot, we don't pay a lot of attention to the things that are happening. So our memories get laid down very flimsily and they're more difficult to recall. So when you're driving or you're doing anything in autopilot, which mind is in control, conscious or subconscious? Well, obviously the subconscious is. And ask yourself a question, how did the subconscious come to be in control? Did you choose a time and deliberately handed control to it, or did it happen automatically? Now, what we know is that it happens automatically when things become familiar. It happens without your knowledge, without your awareness, and without your permission. And if it happens to us when we're driving, will it also be happening to people at work, especially those that are doing repetitive tasks? Well, of course, you bet. We're all biologically wired to go on autopilot and use habits to get things done. It's part of being human. So what's going on in our brain when we're on autopilot? Well, our brain prefers to use habits. Why? Because they're fast and they use minimal energy. Now, when we're doing familiar things, they tend to feel safe. And when we feel safe, we release cannabinoids that enable habits to take over. Now, we could have a whole discussion about cannabis and cannabinoids, but we're going to put that one aside and leave it for another day. So this is what happens. The conscious mind is really good when things are new or different, but it's slow and it uses a lot more energy, like 100 times more energy. So the brain doesn't want to use it unless it's absolutely necessary. And it deems it absolutely necessary about 5% of the time. Much more efficient, much more effective to use habits to get things done. Problem is that habits get things done with no or little conscious thought, and that results in inattention. Now, when I talk about habits, most people tend to think of habits in terms of physical things that people do. But the way in which we interpret what goes on around us, mental habits, they suffer from exactly the same process. So when I talk about habits, it's not just the physical aspects, but it's also the mental aspects as well. So what we found is that habits sit on an attention spectrum. When things are familiar, we're going to do them on autopilot with little or no thinking. But then the habits that come out of autopilot, there's different types. You can have an attentive habit. So when you're driving, you're keeping your eyes on the road. You can have a partly attentive habit. When you're driving, you keep your eyes on the road, but you look at the scenery from time to time. Or you can have an inattentive habit. You text while you're driving. Now, if you have an attentive habit, people will see you as someone that's being situationally aware. If you have inattentive habits, people will see you as somebody complacent. And when we look at the kind of, or the type of habits that people have, what we find is that inattentive habits are the most common ones. Now, when you think about, being on autopilot, the important thing to recognize is that you can't stop people going on autopilot. We have no choice. But what you do have a choice about is which habit comes into play. The problem is that it's not an in-the-moment decision. In the past, because of the second brain myth, which is, you can consciously control safety, people tended to think that the only choice you had was in the moment. When you start looking at the neuroscience, what you find is that a lot of these things are built in, they're wired in, so the choice is not really at the time that it happens, the choice happened sometime before. So the habits, from our perspective, are choices we made, but what we allowed ourselves to repeat. And one of the sayings that we teach people is what we repeat, we get to keep. Now that is a very simple, rephrasing of what is called Hebb's law. And Hebb's law is neurons that fire together, wire together. And Donald Hebb got a Nobel Prize for the research that he did in order to find that out. So if you ask ourselves, how do we get on autopilot? One of the first things we need people to recognize is that both minds, the conscious and the subconscious, are always working. It's just that only one of them controls behavior in the moment, and that is based on the situation. So if we were to plot the level of attention as a function of repetition for something we all learn how to do, like driving, what would it look like? So if you cast your mind back to when you first got behind the steering wheel of the car, where was your level of attention, high or low? Most people will tell us it's high. You're paying full attention because you didn't know what you were doing, right? So is that the conscious mind or the subconscious mind in control? But obviously it's new, it's different. So that's the conscious mind in control. That's what the conscious mind is good for. Now, as you increase repetition, what happens to that level of attention? It starts to drop. So in your brain, what's happening is that the neurons, the brain cells, are starting to make little connections. And the more connections they make, the more things they do in an automated fashion. And as you continue with that repetition, what you find is that certain things that you're doing automatically you don't have to pay a great deal of attention for. Right? That is the autopilot brain mode. It's familiar, it feels safe, so your brain goes, well, I don't really have to pay attention to it. And because it's in autopilot, we're using habits. And if you have attentive habits, you tend to be somebody that's situationally aware. If you have inattentive habits, you tend to be seen as somebody complacent. So when we look at the autopilot, that's obviously the subconscious mind that's in control in that zone. But when the subconscious is in control of in the moment behavior, what's your conscious mind doing? And the answer to that is whatever it likes. From my perspective, I tend to use the words it time travels. So it looks at the past and go, what can I learn from that so that I don't make the same mistakes into the future? And you also look at the future and go, what's coming and how can I best prepare it? So when you look at that graph, that is how people learn. If you want to learn how to hit a tennis ball or a golf ball, you go through that graph. If you want to learn how to play a musical instrument, you go through that graph. If you want to get better at playing Sudoku, you go through that graph. So if you put, of all the things that you do, you're on this graph. So if you put all those graphs one on top of each other, 95% of the time you're going to be in the red zone. And 5% of the time you're either going to be in the green or in the yellow zone. And last time we spoke about 4 main brain modes. So there's conscious control, there's autopilot, but because most of our habits tend to be inattentive, people tend to talk about complacency. We've also got stress, and those things like rushing, frustration, impatience, irritation, anger, that kind of stuff. And we've also got fatigue. And I asked you, I said, which one determines what we do most often? And for the last 50 years or so, in safety, we've assumed it's that one. Now, I can tell you there's plenty of science on this. That's not the one. Most of what we do falls under the autopilot, complacency, and inattentive habits. And essentially, most of the things that we do, it's an interplay between the conscious and autopilot. If it's new or different, it's mostly conscious. If it's stuff we've seen previously and it feels familiar, it tends to be autopilot. So if we look at the science of how our brain works, we've got a processing unit, that's the conscious mind, prefrontal cortex, and that's the bit behind your forehead just here that regulates behavior, executive functions, that kind of stuff. And we've also got an impulse generator, that's the subconscious mind, and that's the limbic system. And out of, the output of out of those 2 things is behavior. So if we start with behavior and we work backwards, what do we find? Well, what we find from the neuroscience is that the last step is conscious processing. So from the time we become aware to the time the behavior happens, it's a very short time. That's why everything we do feels so conscious. But what we also know from the neuroscience is that the conscious mind processes what the subconscious feeds to it. And the subconscious has got a series of these automatic patterns which are invisible to us, right? And they're kind of automatic responses to different situations. They got created from the outcomes of our experiences. So up until 15 years ago, we thought the conscious mind was all there was and had the strongest influence. But that's not true. It just feels that way. If it was true, Obi-Wan would not have been able to use those Jedi mind tricks on those weak-minded stormtroopers, right? This is real science. So the brain modes are our main biological default settings. So the conscious mind is like the screen on a smartphone. We think it does everything. And really, we learn how to use our phone through that screen. We know what to press, and all that kind of stuff. But really, what makes it all happen is the subconscious, which from a brain perspective is the autopilot. Now, that's the electronics behind it that make most of it happen. We are not even aware of. So how does the brain work out which brain mode to use? So we have an experience. That can be real, like it happens to me today. That can be vicarious, it happens to somebody else, or it can be imagined. The first thing the brain does is ask the question, what is this most like? So not what is this exactly like, but what is this most like? And it decides whether there's something it can match it to in something like 20 milliseconds without our knowledge, awareness, or permission, right? It's not a conscious process. Majority of the time, it'll be something familiar. And because it's familiar, it'll be an autopilot. That's the brain mode that it'll decide. As soon as it goes to autopilot, we engage a habit. Most of the time, it's going to be an inattentive habit, and we'll see it as complacency. So the habit starts. And then once the habit starts, it informs the prefrontal cortex. That's when we become aware of what we're doing. Now, because we're well into the response by the time we become aware of it, we tend not to want to change. And we just go with whatever the habit says. Now, most people know that texting while driving is illegal, but the ping goes off on their phone and they automatically do that. They automatically look at it. Now, it feels conscious, but it's this kind of process that's taking place. What happens if we have an experience and the brain asks, what is this most like? And it can't match it to anything. Well, when that's the case, none of this stuff happens, and it gives it to the prefrontal cortex and says, hey, work out how we're going to respond and what we need to do about it. So when we do something new or different, there are no automatic patterns in play. So we have to focus on it and think it through. But, it's a slow process and it uses a lot of energy, like 100 times more than using habits. So the brain doesn't want to use it unless it's absolutely necessary. And it deems it necessary only about 5% of the time. And that's the brain mode, conscious control. When we do something for the first time, the prefrontal cortex needs to fire to tell the striatum, which is part of the limbic system, and the motor cortex what to do. It's a lot of work because all the brain cells along the path also need to fire. What we do next depends on the outcome. So the subconscious mind has no concept of risk. We didn't know anything about risk until the 15th century. So it deals with this, the best way that I can describe it is a sense of danger. If you've done it 100 times before and nothing bad's happened, the sense of danger is low, so you're going to repeat it next time. And that's exactly what happens. So the outcome determines what we do. If the outcome is positive, our brain gets a dopamine hit, and because it feels good, we want to repeat, and we do. So think about dopamine as the save button for your brain. You get a dopamine hit, it feels good, you want to do it again. So the negative, if it's negative, the amygdala activates. There's this sort of inhibitor that gets released called GABA, and because it doesn't feel good, we stop repeating. But our brain is a quick learner. So as we repeat, neural circuits build that automate the process between the striatum and the motor cortex. And the PFC gets progressively less and less involved until once the neural circuits are fully established, the PFC is no longer involved. And that's really the way by which we build and establish skills and habits. So, last time I rode a bike was maybe 20 years ago. The circuit is still in my head. It's weakened because I don't do it on a daily basis. But if somebody gives me a bike within 15, 20 minutes, I'm going to be able to ride it reasonably well. So these neural circuits don't disappear. So when we do something familiar, what happens? There's an automatic pattern, because remember, the brain says, what is this most like? So it finds an automatic pattern. Typically, it tends to be an inattentive habit of some kind. Now, it goes to the conscious mind. So the inattentive habit starts, then it goes to the conscious mind, but there's little or no scrutinizing for two reasons. Firstly, is the inattentive habit has already commenced, difficult to change. And secondly, the conscious mind knows that you've done it 1,000 times before and nothing bad's ever happened. So it just allows it to happen. This process is fast, uses minimal energy, and is in play 95% of the time. And we call that brain mode complacency. So when autopilot drives what we do, conscious control drops off naturally. It's comfortable with it, it's familiar, feels safe. That increases avoidable inattention and results in more safety incidents. So let me give you an example, and if you've sort of heard me speak before, you'll know that you've probably heard this example before. Like a friend of mine, he's at a red light, 3 lanes. He's in the middle lane. There's a policeman on the right-hand lane, and there's a car on the left-hand lane. The lights change. My friend looks to the right. He sees a car coming at speed. He doesn't go. The policeman doesn't look. He goes and he gets T-boned. Now, unfortunately, he got hit in the shoulder and he's going to have nerve damage for the rest of his days. So he'll be in pain for the rest of his days. Now, when you look at this scenario, it's a perfectly controlled experiment. Right? 2 people in the same situation at the same place at the same time. One gets in an incident, the other one doesn't. What was the difference? Now, we know that a car going through a red light is not a rare event. And the policemen certainly knew that too. And the only way to avoid a collision under that scenario is to look, because if we look, we see, and if we see, we can avoid. We can't avoid what we don't see, and we don't tend to see unless we look. So with many incidents, especially those outside work, an attentive habit is the only thing that can help us avoid getting hurt. Now, my friend looked first, saw and avoided getting hurt. The policeman relied on traffic rules, didn't look, didn't see, and will be in pain for the rest of his life. Now, the interesting thing here is that my friend looked first without even thinking about it, because at the time he was having a deep and meaningful discussion with his daughter, who's studying law and apparently sort of argues for a living. She argues against everything. So how is it that his conscious mind is engaged fully in a conversation, the lights goes green and he looked? How is that possible? Well, the reason why that's possible is because habits do not live in our conscious mind. Habits live in our subconscious mind. Now, he practiced look first, then move often enough to make it a very strong habit. And it came into play automatically. And that made all the difference. Now, he knows, as well as I do, that the only way to make a behavior reliable is to make it a habit. And the only way you can make it a habit is to repeat it over and over again. So an attentive habit gave him an extra layer of protection independent of the traffic rules that most people just don't have. The policeman certainly didn't have it. Which begs the question in a work context, how can we apply that? So if I said to you, is the safety system always 100% effective? Now, we've asked this question of many people and the answer is always no. Nothing is 100% effective. So what keeps people safe at work when the safety system fails? Well, when the safety system failed, if the person is paying attention to what can hurt them, they see it earlier and they've got more of a chance to get out of the way. What keeps people safe outside of work, where there are some rules but not a safety system? Well, that's pretty much about the individual, and that's a reflection on how good they are at paying attention generally. So people with attentive habits give themselves an extra layer of protection independent of the system, independent of the traffic rules and whatever else, everywhere. So if you think about this in a different way, okay, at work, your first line of defense is the system. Your second line of defense is how good you are at paying attention. Outside of work, your first and only line of defense most of the time is how good you are at paying attention. So if you care about your people's safety at work, only do things around the worker. If you care about your people's safety everywhere, help them get attentive habits, because they will come to their rescue everywhere. So when you talk about attention, attention does not scale. And what I mean by that is that it's not like we can insert an additional piece of brain into our heads and all of a sudden we're going to have more attention than we normally do. whatever amount of attention you've got is how you need to use it. So the question really is, how does it get allocated? So we think it's based on the risk of a task or a situation, what's dangerous, what's important. And sometimes it is, but not as often as we think. It's mostly to do with what we have conditioned ourselves to pay attention to through repetition. So we have two types of attention. We have top-down attention. We control consciously, so it can be directed to help us achieve our goals. And because we're aware of it and can direct it, we think that is all we have. What people aren't aware of is the second type of attention, which is bottom-up attention. We control it subconsciously via our habits. And it underpins the vast majority of our safety, and we're not even aware of it. Most of our attention is bottom-up attention. So bottom-up attention comes into play automatically in the moment when we go on autopilot, attached to your habit. But if you have an inattentive habit, when attention is allocated in ways that limit our ability to detect what could hurt us, and this increases our chances of getting hurt. Now, if you allocate it, if you've got attentive habits, now this occurs when attention is allocated in ways that enhance our ability to detect what could hurt us, and this decreases our chances of getting hurt. And this allocation happens without our knowledge, without our awareness, and without our permission. It all happens under the hood, if you like. So when we're inattentive, what's the most common safety consequence? I think if you've seen these webinars before, I've used this slide before. Now, most people will say an incident of some kind. And that is not the right answer. So if an incident of some kind is not the right answer, what's the right answer? The right answer is no incident. So think about it this way. If every time we were inattentive, we had an incident, what would we teach ourselves to do? We would teach ourselves to be more attentive. But since most of the time when we're inattentive, nothing happens, we repeat the inattention over and over, even though it is avoidable, or most of it is, and we end up with inattentive habits. Now, that's not the worst, right? It happens without us even knowing about it, which makes it a huge blind spot for the worker and for the leader as well. And what we know about human beings is we do nothing about our blind spots because we don't even know that they're there. So the biggest obstacle to minimizing inattention is people think it is only ever present when there is an incident. Now, that fits their experience because they will only look for inattention when there is an incident. They won't look for inattention when they have no incident at all. People walk and look at the mobile phones. That's an inattentive habit, but unless you have an incident, you're not going to notice the inattention because most of the time nothing happens. So we did an interesting study to do with the habit, one of the attentive habits that we teach, which is look first, then move. Before and after we did some training. So before we started to do the training, we asked people, okay, give yourself a percentage out of 100 of how good you think you are at look first, then move. And you can see there that it got sort of somewhere between 75 and 80, so in the high 70s. And then what we did is we actually observed people in the workplace and sort of came up with a rating. And that's what we found, which was sort of from 25 to 30. And we thought, well, maybe the reason why it's so low is because they're so sort of familiar with the environment at work. So a friend of mine was working in security, and he gave me access to a whole bunch of different videos at train stations and bus stations and shopping centres and a whole bunch of different places. And wherever we could see what people were doing with their eyes, we would make an assessment. And what we found is, in general, so 25 to 30% is about right. Just about no one is 40 or above, unless, because we have met some people that are 40 or above, and those people had a bad incident that caused them a lot of pain, and they didn't want to go through that again. So they got a lot better at looking first and then moving. So we asked ourselves a question, said, why are people's beliefs so inflated? And what we noticed was that people only notice when they remember to do it. And they think that's 100%, but it's not that often. They don't notice when they don't remember to do it, which is most of the time. Right? So we started from this perspective, and then we did the training, and we asked the same question of people after the training, and they went from thinking they were sort of 75 to thinking they were 95 plus. And when we actually measured after the training, we got them to improve, but certainly not to the level of perfection that they saw themselves. So when you think about that, right? So we're dealing with humans, so we're not dealing with perfection, but after the training, people were 3 times more attentive, and on average, that led to five times less incidents in the workplaces. That's the place where we could actually measure it. So inattention, most of which is avoidable, is a temporary cognitive impairment that is part of being human. When we're inattentive, we surrender control of our safety when we don't have to. We could keep control of our safety by managing the subconscious brain modes better. And that's really what we teach people to do. So from time to time, the term human error sort of appears. And what we noticed is that usually when the term appears, there was avoidable inattention in play, like the person didn't look, and it resulted in a bad outcome. So it's interesting that a lot of the times I hear, especially on LinkedIn, that human error is normal. The definition of error is a deviation from normal. So how can a deviation from normal be normal? If that's the case, we need to redefine normal. What we think is that human error is common, like obesity and cancer. But with obesity and cancer, we do things to try and minimize it. Right? And we can do exactly the same with human error because we know that most of it comes from inattention, and inattention is avoidable. Why safety resists? I'm not sure. So what approaches don't work? And I know that they're well-meaning, but they're kind of destined to fail because they don't work with how the brain works. They work against it. And the first one is telling people. So telling people to pay more attention, be more careful, don't get complacent, keep safety front of mind, use attentive habits, all that kind of stuff. And the problem is that telling doesn't work, right? Now, if telling worked, parenting would be a lot easier. I know that's certainly the case with my children. The other one that comes up a lot is job rotation or task switching. Right? And the problem with that one is that if you're familiar with doing something, it only takes a few seconds, less than a minute, to start doing something in autopilot. And a lot of the times with an attentive habit. So think about how long it takes you to get into autopilot once you get into your car and drive. Not very long at all. So some organizations we work with tell us, oh no, we've sorted out complacency, we do this job rotation and task switching. And I go, so what do you do? And they say to me, well, every 2 hours we'll swap people from one task to another. And I ask them, so are these tasks familiar to these people or are they new or different? And most of the time they're tasks that they're familiar with. So in my head, I'm going, okay, well, maybe they'll, the change of task, and attention will last for a minute or two, but the majority of those 2 hours, if it's familiar and they're used to doing it, people are going to do it in autopilot. What other approaches don't really work? So including complacency or inattentive habits in the safety paperwork, knowledge is not enough to deal with them effectively. They need to develop better skills in order to do that. Or having more or better conversations about the importance of safety. The problem with that, of course, is that it helps at first while the process is new or different, but it really becomes ineffective after a short while once it becomes familiar. And that's really been the issue with behaviour-based safety. So these approaches tried to solve a badly defined problem, and they defined it as not enough knowledge or a lack of conscious control, and leads to thinking about autopilot and complacency as bugs in the system of human behaviour. And because they're seen as bugs in the system of human behaviour, people try to stop them from happening. And when they fail, they throw their hands up in the air and go, oh, it all happens in people's heads. There is nothing we can do. Not true. No. Autopilot and complacency are not bugs in the system of human behaviour. They are the main system. No. So we need to find ways to work with how the brain works. Or otherwise, safety will continue to be a challenge. Up until now, we've only found ways to work against how the brain works. And that is picking a fight with our biology. There's no point picking a fight with our biology because it's a fight that we're going to lose. And that's what happened with behaviour-based safety. Try to make autopilot-conscious, fail, gone. We need to work with how our brain works. We need to understand how the brain works and work with it rather than against it. So the most effective way to do that is to upgrade inattentive habits to attentive habits. The what is easy. Like I've given you the main one, look first, then move. The how is challenging. Right? And if you don't have a good understanding of the discoveries of neuroscience, finding a way to do it effectively can take you a while. Now, we've been doing this now for more than 15 years. We're getting better every year. And there's not a great deal that we need to change, but it's taken us that long to trial and error things in order to find the best way by which to do it. So human nature, the problem is that the more we do for them, is that the less or the more they do for themselves. It's the less they do for themselves. And this causes a bit of a problem because when we don't do anything to help people change to attentive habits, we can only do things around the worker. What happens is the worker starts to pay less attention to what can hurt them. Now, I know that this may not make sense, but this is exactly what happens with human beings because we don't think like scientists, we think like lawyers. If somebody else is doing things around us, then something less we have to worry about. Now, maybe an incident happens and someone gets hurt. And what we've observed is that the worker starts issuing blame certificates. That's the terminology we use. Now, I know some people that issue blame certificates for a living. And I can tell you that issuing blame certificates doesn't do much apart from making you feel better. It doesn't prevent anything, but it does make people feel better. So when worker issues blame certificate, what we do is we do even more things around the worker. And as time goes by, the worker becomes even more inattentive. So we get into this vicious cycle of where the more we do for them, the more inattentive they become, the more inattentive they become, incidents happen and we've got to do more for them. And then the more we do for them, the more inattentive they become. So what it does, it enables the vicious cycle of victim mentality. Because if what we're going out there and saying is that we're only going to do things around the worker, then it's not the worker's problem. So what it boils down to is this. We either control our subconscious brain modes or they control us. That's the choice that each of us have to make. By only doing things around the worker, we are mitigating risk in the short term. That's a good thing. But unfortunately, we don't think about the long-term impact because we're mitigating risk in the short term at the expense of people's ability to pay attention in the long term. And that's not something that's good for us in the long term. So to improve safety performance, what do we need to do? So we need to improve our ability to influence because that opens the lines of communication, show care, build trust, be inclusive, psychological safety. All these things are good, right? But you can't just do that. Because if you just do that, is a panacea of wishful thinking. What we do know from the data is that inattention trumps all of those. If you look up the data of how many kids aged 1 to 14 sort of died, the majority of them died because there was some sort of traffic accident. They got run over. So have a think about this. Where do you think most of them are getting run over? Now, most of them are getting run over in their own driveways. Who's running them over? People that care about them, people that love them. So even though there's a lot of caring and a lot of love for their children, people do still run them over because they don't paying as much attention as they can. So we open the lines of communication. That's an important piece. But then we need to address the areas that impact safety. And to date, we've done those three reasonably well. These days, not so much the conscious control. That's the one that's really missing. So for us, things we do around the worker, they're good things to do. Keep doing those. But we also need to do things with the worker. Because if we do that, especially the subconscious brain modes, then people are going to be more attentive. And when the system fails or things, sometimes the world doesn't do the things that you wanted to do for your own safety, then at least you've got a few more skills to be able to help you stay safe and not get hurt. So what we've noticed is that good safety leaders address all areas that impact safety, not just the things that they like, not just the things that they're comfortable with. Now, if we're really serious about safety, it makes sense to use everything at our disposal, do as much as we can around the person, the worker, but also work with them. And if we want to work with them effectively, we need a whole of brain approach, not just the conscious mind, but also understanding the impact the subconscious mind has and helping people deal with those subconscious brain modes. So helping people deal with their subconscious brain modes is not really a do-it-yourself thing. It needs a new set of skills that most people just don't have. So in order to be effective, what we found is people need some new knowledge and a bit of conscious control at first in order to help them practice. That's about 10% of the effort. But you also need an ongoing process that continually rewires the subconscious to be automatically safer. And that's about 90% of the effort. So the way that we explain this to workers is to say, look, knowing that exercise makes you fit doesn't make you fit. You need to do the exercise. But if you manage to make the exercising a habit, it's much easier to stay fit. It's exactly the same thing that we're trying to do here with attentive habits. Now, we use the discoveries of neuroscience to design an efficient and effective process to do just that. Because for us, trying to influence people to be safer without helping them deal with the subconscious brain modes is treating the symptom and ignoring the cause. So when we talk about most human behaviour, it's really a battle or competition for control between two main brain modes. Autopilot or complacency, and that's kind of dominates 95% of the time because most of what we do is familiar. And we've got conscious control, which comes into play sort of 5% of the time when things are new or different. So only one of them controls behaviour in the moment. But that is not the whole story. There is also two main disruptors. So stress, things like rushing, frustration, impatience, anger, that kind of stuff, and fatigue. And what they do is they take out the autopilot and the conscious control out of the game, and they use those automatic responses, which are different under stress and under fatigue, in order to determine what people do. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a deeper look at stress and fatigue next time. They're the main disruptors of autopilot and conscious control. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, I've written a book which you can buy either electronically from Kobo or through our website. You can go to our website and you can download the first 3 chapters free. On our website and also on Spotify and wherever else it's available, we've done about 7 or 8 Safety Frontiers podcasts, which are sort of talking about the kind of stuff we talked about on this webinar and the previous one and the next one as well. And I'm also on LinkedIn. If you want to send me an invite to connect, I'm more than happy to accept it. Now, Christina, I might sort of hand it back to you and see if there are any questions that I need to field.
Cristian, as always, you were amazing. Thank you so much for your knowledge and the time that you've taken to share with us. There were 2 questions that sort of lead into each other. The first one, and I know you sort of touched on this a little bit during the session, but the first one is, can being on autopilot have an impact on how we identify risks and how we assign mitigation measures at workplaces, seeing that subconscious inherently influences behaviours?
Okay, so read that out again.
Can being on autopilot have an impact on how we identify risks and how we assign mitigation measures at workplaces?
Look, the issue that we have is that when you're in autopilot, your subconscious is not thinking about risk. It's thinking about a sense of danger. So when you're on autopilot, you're doing something familiar. It feels normal. It feels safe. So you don't tend to think about risk. Now, what you can do is you can actually build a habit to look for risk in a wider scenario than what you normally would. So I imagine, and mitigation, I mean, once you identify the risk and you think that you need to do something about it, then whatever the mitigation is, you get to decide what that is. So the main problem with autopilot is because it feels normal, right? You're not paying a great deal of attention and it feels safe. You just tend to do what you normally do, right? So when I talk to people about, texting and driving, and I say to them, do you know it's illegal? And they go, yeah. And I said, do you know that it increases risk significantly? And some of them could actually quote you the percentages. They go, yeah. And you say to them, so why is it that you still do it? And most of them say is, well, because I've done it plenty of times before and nothing bad's ever happened. So what we need to do is we need to get away from the concept of risk, which is a very conscious thing, and start thinking about attentive habits. So the question really is, if you want people to see something or notice something that will hurt them, what kind of habits do they need to have? So look first, then move, will save you when the red light goes green and somebody's gone through a red light. Now, there was no risk in my friend's head at all during that period. He just had an attentive habit. So the argument that we're making is, rather than retrofit all this stuff into the jargon that we've used for the last 40 to 50 years about and all this kind of stuff, what we need to do is we need to say, okay, what are the habits that will prevent most incidents? Now, we've done the research, we know what that is. And then once you know what that is, that's the first step. The second step is, how do we get it into people's heads so that they use it without having to think about it? Because the only way that you can make any behaviour reliable is to make it habitual.
Amazing. That was a really good, I think, well, I think it did. It definitely put a spin on how to look at it and a different way to understand the context.
Look, and if I could add something, the issue that we have as safety professionals is that we always go back to the mental models that we used and we're comfortable with. Right? And what the discoveries of neuroscience are saying is that those mental models, some of them are incomplete, some of them are incorrect. So we need to look at the science and go, okay, there might be a different way to look at this. And that's really what I advocate. And this is kind of the work that we do, is looking at things from a different perspective in order to help people be safer automatically.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, everybody. What I will do is take a note of the questions that we didn't get a chance to get to today, and we can look at them again next presentation for our third session. I will email everybody a copy of today's recording so you can all have this once it's all done. Again, Cristian, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing everybody in the next session. Thanks, guys.